In August 1648, inside a single sprawling palace complex overlooking the Bosphorus, a 6-year-old boy was placed on one of the most powerful thrones on the entire earth. In another room of that exact same enormous building, at almost the exact same moment, his own father was being strangled to death on the orders of the empire's own most powerful ruling institutions. The boy was Mehmed the Fourth. His father was Ibrahim, remembered ever since across nearly 4 centuries by a nickname that still shapes how people picture him today, Ibrahim the Mad. Ibrahim became the 18th Ottoman Sultan in 1640, and he got the job less through personal ambition or any careful, deliberate preparation than through simple, unavoidable elimination of every other realistic candidate available. By the time his brother, Sultan Mehmed the Fourth, died suddenly in 1640 after a reign widely known for its own brutal, ruthless severity, Ibrahim was the only surviving adult male left in the entire ruling dynasty, which made the succession more of a bureaucratic formality than any kind of genuine choice. Before that, Ibrahim had spent most of his early life confined in what was called the cafes, or golden cage, a secluded, heavily guarded section of the imperial palace reserved specifically for princes who weren't next in line to rule. Princes could be kept there for years, sometimes entire decades, cut off almost completely from real experience of governing or even ordinary daily court life, specifically to prevent them from building outside alliances or plotting against whichever brother currently held the throne. Contemporaries at the time, and plenty of respected later historians since, believed that years of that kind of total isolation, with no meaningful preparation whatsoever for the responsibility that awaited him, left Ibrahim mentally and emotionally unstable well before he ever actually inherited real power. His mother, Kösem Sultan, had a very different relationship with power entirely, one built on decades of hard-won practical experience rather than years of forced solitary isolation. She'd been captured and enslaved as a teenager in Greece and clawed her way up through the entire palace hierarchy, one calculated step at a time, to become the single most influential woman in the empire. When Ibrahim became sultan, Kösem initially guided him closely through the earliest, most uncertain months of his entirely unexpected reign, and she continued exercising very real, hands-on authority behind the palace scenes for years afterward, largely undisturbed by rivals. That arrangement suited both of them for a good, comfortable, while each getting exactly what they actually wanted out of it. Ibrahim got the title, the ceremony, and every comfort the throne could offer him. Kösem got to keep running an empire she'd already spent long years quietly learning to manage from the shadows behind him. It was, in its own strange, quietly unbalanced way, a genuinely functional system of shared power for a surprisingly long stretch of time, right up until the exact moment it very publicly, dramatically stopped being one at all. As Sultan, Ibrahim increasingly withdrew from actual state governance altogether over the passing years and immersed himself completely, almost exclusively, in the pleasures of his enormous harem instead of any real, serious business of ruling an empire. He reportedly furnished an entire room lined wall-to-wall with imported lynx and sable fur, and lavished genuinely extraordinary sums of the imperial treasury's money on rare textiles, imported perfumes, and fine jewelry for the many women who surrounded him daily. Court records and later chronicles alike describe a ruler almost entirely absent from actual state business during these long years, consumed instead by increasingly elaborate, increasingly expensive personal indulgence that visibly alarmed even his own closest inner circle of advisors and officials. Even his own infant son wasn't safe from his volatile, unpredictable temper, according to the accounts that survive from that turbulent period. Not long after Mehmed was born, Ibrahim and the boy's mother had a violent, screaming quarrel inside the palace. In a fit of blind, uncontrolled rage, Ibrahim reportedly tore the infant from her arms and threw him bodily into a cistern somewhere within the palace grounds. Palace servants rushed in immediately and rescued the baby, who survived the fall but carried a visible scar for the rest of his life. Here's a genuine point modern historians still actively argue about today, long after the fact and the surviving evidence has been picked apart repeatedly. Some now question whether Ibrahim was actually clinically insane at all, or whether madness was simply a convenient, politically useful smear spread by rivals who wanted him gone and needed a justification the wider public could accept without much scrutiny. Whatever the underlying truth actually was, the reputation stuck completely and permanently in the surviving historical record, which is exactly why he's still remembered today, centuries later, specifically and almost exclusively as Ibrahim the Mad. By 1648, after years of mounting frustration and growing financial strain across the empire, an unusual and genuinely dangerous coalition had quietly formed against him. The Janissary military corps, the empire's highest religious authorities, and, most strikingly of all, his own mother. Kösem reportedly justified turning on her own son bluntly and without much visible sentiment, warning the other conspirators gathered around her that he would eventually destroy everyone around him, and the empire itself, if he stayed on the throne any longer. Ibrahim was formally deposed within days of that coalition quietly forming behind his back. On August 18, 1648, he was strangled inside the palace while his own mother and a group of senior court officials reportedly watched the entire execution unfold from a window positioned above the room. His 6-year-old son was placed on the throne in that same enormous building, within those exact same walls, essentially the very same day. A small boy suddenly becoming the absolute ruler of a vast, sprawling empire practically within earshot of his own father's death only hours before. With Mehmed the Fourth far too young to actually rule anything on his own by even the most generous possible standard, real power fell to a regency built entirely around the most senior, most experienced women of the palace. First, it was his own grandmother, the very same Kösem Sultan who had personally approved his father's execution just days earlier without much apparent hesitation, now stepping in to guide the very grandson she'd effectively helped orphan in the process. Then, gradually over time, it became his own mother, Turhan Hatis, a former slave herself, who had very different, increasingly assertive ideas about who should really be running the empire on behalf of her young son. The two women became bitter, steadily escalating rivals for control of the actual government during a remarkable period historians now call the Sultanate of Women, a name chosen specifically to describe exactly this kind of arrangement. This wasn't symbolic influence exercised quietly from behind a curtain somewhere, easily dismissed later by court historians writing for male rulers. These were women wielding direct, unambiguous political power over one of the largest, wealthiest empires on the entire earth. Entire court factions formed around each of them separately, competing constantly for favor, resources, and influence, and the rivalry between grandmother and mother became one of the single defining political conflicts of Mehmed's entire early childhood at the palace. The rivalry didn't stay anywhere close to peaceful for very long, and both sides knew exactly what was ultimately at stake for the loser. In 1651, in a palace coup carefully organized by Turhan Hatis's own supporters, Kösem Sultan was ambushed inside her own private quarters late at night. She was strangled to death that same night by men who had once served directly under her own authority, ending the life of arguably the most powerful woman in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire in almost exactly the same method she had personally approved for her own son 3 years earlier, down to the smallest detail. The same woman who had helped end Ibrahim's life ended up losing her own life the very same way, years later, at the hands of people loyal to the very daughter-in-law she had spent years competing against for real, lasting political power. Mehmed, still only a child of 9 years old at the time, had now effectively watched the two most powerful women in his entire life eliminate each other through the exact same kind of palace violence that had already quietly defined his entire early childhood from the very start of it. In 1656, seeking real, lasting stability after years of relentless palace chaos and infighting between rival factions, Turhan Hatis appointed the elderly, famously ruthless Köprülü Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier, granting him sweeping, almost unprecedented authority in exchange for competent, no-nonsense governance. That single decision effectively transferred real, working power away from the palace women entirely and into the hands of the Köprülü family, who would go on to run the vast empire's actual day-to-day affairs for decades to come, largely uninterrupted by further court intrigue. Mehmed grew into full adulthood with an entirely different set of priorities than governing ever seemed to be for him, having watched firsthand what it actually cost the people who tried. He earned the nickname Avki, the Hunter, for a genuine, lifelong passion that consumed far more of his personal attention and energy than statecraft ever really did. For years, that unusual arrangement actually worked reasonably well for nearly everyone involved in it, palace women included. Competent Köprülü viziers handled the empire's real, day-to-day business while Mehmed happily pursued the outdoors instead, and the empire remained largely stable, functional, and militarily effective throughout, expanding its borders even further in some frontier regions during this same stretch of years. That long stability collapsed catastrophically in September 1683, when a massive Ottoman army that had been besieging the city of Vienna itself for weeks was decisively crushed by a combined Austrian and Polish-Lithuanian relief force under King John III Sobieski of Poland. The military disaster triggered years of continued territorial losses across the frontier and mounting political pressure back home in the capital. Pressure that a hunting-obsessed, largely absent sultan simply had no real, workable answer for after decades of quietly letting others handle the difficult, complicated work of actually running the empire instead. On November 8, 1687, after months of growing unrest, Mehmed was formally deposed by a combined force of Janissaries and allied troops and quietly replaced by his own younger brother, Suleyman II, meaning his entire life, from the 6-year-old boy crowned directly above his father's own execution to the deposed adult ruler decades later, had been bookended almost perfectly by the exact same kind of political coalition that had killed the father he never really got the chance to actually know.